The topic of this lecture is mortgages. A mortgage can play an essential role in the purchase of real property. A mortgage is defined as a conveyance of an interest in real property that's made to secure performance of an obligation. For the purposes of this lecture, we're going to focus on the obligation that arises out of the loan of money to facilitate the purchase, repair, or development of real property. Usually, a mortgage has two documents. The first is the mortgage deed, and the second is the promissory note. Sometimes these two documents are combined into one document, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to treat them as they were traditionally, as two separate documents. We'll begin with the mortgage deed. The mortgage deed is a document that conveys an interest in real property that's designed to secure performance of a debt. Because a mortgage involves a transfer of an interest in real property, the statute of frauds requires that the mortgage be evidenced by a writing. This writing has to be, of course, properly executed. For example, in Florida, the mortgage has to be signed by the mortgagor and witnessed by two witnesses. And in addition, to complete the transfer of the mortgaged property, the mortgage deed must be delivered to the mortgagee. Essential terms must be included in the mortgage document. At a minimum, the mortgage document has to identify the parties to the mortgage. And let's review a little bit of vocabulary here. The mortgagor is the owner of the real property, the person who is going to buy the property, who borrows money and secures the debt with a mortgage on the property. The mortgagee is the lender of the money that's borrowed, the bank or the financial institution to whom the mortgage is made. The mortgage deed must also include a description of the property. Now, for the purposes of the statute of frauds, the description has to be simply sufficient to identify the property so that the parties know what property is being bought and sold. However, it's always a good idea to include a more detailed description because, as we'll see in later lectures, a mortgage is a recordable document, and more detail in the description of property is required for a recordable document. In addition, the mortgage deed must show intent to create a security interest. And finally, as I mentioned again, the mortgage deed is a recordable document and in most cases should be recorded. The second document involved in a mortgage is the promissory note. The note represents the mortgage obligation. So it's a kind of IOU that creates personal liability in the mortgagor. The mortgagor promises to repay the mortgage debt to the mortgagee, to the lender. The mortgage note has a number of parts. First of all, it will identify the loan amount, how much money is being borrowed. Second, it will indicate the interest rate on the note. The interest rate can be fixed, which means it's set for the term of the loan, or it can be adjustable, which means it can vary over the term of the loan. The mortgage note also indicates the loan term. A typical mortgage is 30 years, although many mortgages can be set for a shorter period, such as 15 years. The mortgage note will also include the payment schedule, and there are many different types of payment schedules that can be made. We'll discuss just a few of the typical examples here. The first is the level payment mortgage. In a level payment obligation, the principal and the interest are amortized over the full term of the loan, and then the mortgagor pays a fixed amount throughout the term of the loan. When the final payment is made, that payment satisfies the loan and the mortgage will be discharged. The second type of payment schedule is a balloon mortgage. In a balloon mortgage, the loan is amortized over a relatively long period of time, but the payment schedule calls for a short period of time. So small payments are made for a few years, and then the full amount, the balloon, becomes due and payable at the end of a relatively short period, such as 5 years. Now, in a balloon payment, relatively small monthly payments are made, but that large payment will hit at the end of the balloon period. The mortgage note may also include one or all of the following clauses. The first is a prepayment clause. A prepayment clause will permit the mortgagor to pay the mortgage amount early. However, that clause will set a penalty for the privilege of early prepayment. The second type of clause is an acceleration clause. An acceleration clause permits the mortgagee to declare the entire amount of the mortgage obligation due and payable if the mortgagor defaults for any reason. The third type of clause is a due on sale clause, which is typically included in a mortgage note today. In a due on sale clause, the entire balance is due on the note and must be paid before the mortgagor can sell the property to a potential buyer. Once a mortgagor satisfies, that is, pays the mortgage debt, then the mortgagee should execute a document that releases the mortgage, and this particular document, the release document, should be recorded. Next, we're going to discuss mortgage theories, which we considered last semester when we read Chapter 5. The jurisdictions are split on the nature of the interests held by the mortgagor and the mortgagee after the execution of the mortgage deed. There are three theories, two of which we discussed first semester. The first is the title theory, the second is the lien theory, both of which we discussed first semester, and the third is the intermediate theory, which we did not discuss first semester. Let's start with the traditional theory, which is the title theory. Under the title theory, the mortgagee, that's the lender, receives legal title to the mortgaged property and thus gets the right to take possession of and collect rents and profits from the property immediately on execution of the mortgage deed. The mortgagee's title, however, is subject to a condition subsequent, which divests title from the mortgagee if the mortgagor repays the loan by the due date. However, until she repays the loan in a timely fashion, the mortgagor retains no more than an equitable interest in the property. As we learned first semester, the title theory is now a distinct minority view. There is, however, a modern approach to the title theory, and in a title theory state, some now recognize that the mortgagee holds title for security purposes only, and therefore the mortgagor is viewed as the owner of the land. The second theory is the lien theory. As we learned last semester, in a lien theory jurisdiction, the mortgagee, the lender, receives a lien on the property, and the mortgagor, the borrower, retains legal title and possession of the property unless and until foreclosure occurs. Most states, of course, now adhere to the lien theory. The third theory, the one we did not discuss first semester, is the intermediate theory. In this particular type of jurisdiction, the mortgagor retains legal title until a default occurs, and on a default, legal title and possession pass to the mortgagee, who then can begin to collect rents and profits. However, the intermediate theory is not very different from the title theory, because in a title theory jurisdiction, the mortgagee rarely asserts the right to possess prior to a default, and only a few states adhere to the intermediate theory. As we learned first semester, the type of theory followed in a jurisdiction can have a significant effect if one joint tenant decides to mortgage his or her interest in property held in a joint tenancy. Under a title theory, of course, if one joint tenant mortgages her interest, the mortgagee receives legal title, and therefore the four unities have been destroyed and a severance of the joint tenancy will occur. However, in a lien theory jurisdiction, again as we learned first semester, no severance occurs when the mortgage is made because the unities remain intact. However, even in a lien theory jurisdiction, if a foreclosure sale occurs because of a default by the mortgagor, then the joint tenancy will be severed. Next, we're going to discuss another topic that should be familiar from first semester, and that's waste. failure to make a mortgage payment can constitute waste. If a person holds a life tenancy in mortgaged property, that person has a duty to pay interest on the mortgage to the extent of rents and profits derived from a third person in possession of the property, or the reasonable rental value of the property if the life tenant remains on the premises. Now remember again, the life tenant pays the interest on the mortgage. The person who holds the remainder interest in the mortgaged property has a duty to pay the principal. In the case of a leasehold tenant, unless the lease provides otherwise, a tenant for years or a periodic tenant has no common law duty to make mortgage payments. And typically a residential tenant will not have a duty to make mortgage payments. However, a lease that is commercial in nature may require the leasehold tenant to make at least a portion of the mortgage payments. If waste has occurred on the part of a life tenant or a leasehold tenant in respect to a mortgage, a variety of remedies are available. First, the mortgagee can foreclose on the property. Second, the mortgagee can obtain an injunction that prohibits future waste or requires the tenant to make the appropriate repairs. Third, the mortgagee can recover damages which may be limited by the amount of the waste. And that, of course, is to the extent that the waste has impaired the mortgagee's security interest. The mortgagor's interest in mortgaged property is oftentimes called the equity, which is short for equity of redemption. At any time after default, but before foreclosure, the mortgagor has an absolute right to redeem the property by paying the debt due. And in fact, that right to redeem cannot be waived, which is oftentimes called clogged, at the time the mortgage is created. In some jurisdictions, the mortgagor also has a statutory right to redeem the property, and that statutory right will extend for a period of 6 to 12 months usually after a foreclosure sale has occurred. With a statutory right to redeem, the mortgagor must match the foreclosure price. Let's now consider the foreclosure sale. Today, a mortgagee typically forecloses on a mortgage by forcing sale of the property. And that forced sale may be accomplished either through a power of sale, if that power is included in the mortgage document, or by court order. Whether the sale is accomplished by a power of sale or by court order, the foreclosure sale must be, first of all, public in nature. It has to be properly noticed, and it has to be conducted in a reasonable manner that's usually regulated by statute. In addition, the mortgage sale must result in a fair sale price. Now, that fair price is not necessarily the market price for the property. Rather, it's arrived as a result of the mortgagee's due diligence in conducting the foreclosure sale. And a foreclosure sale will not be set aside for inadequacy unless that sale price is so grossly inadequate that it shocks the conscience. If a foreclosure sale occurs, then it terminates the mortgagor's interest in the mortgaged property. Once a mortgage sale occurs, the proceeds of the sale will be distributed in the following order. First of all, the cost of the sale will always be satisfied. Then the security interest that's foreclosed will be satisfied with certain caveats. Next, junior lien holders that are terminated by the sale, and then following to the mortgagor if any proceeds remain. Let's try several problems that illustrate how the proceeds of a foreclosure sale are distributed. We begin with mortgagor in 2007 who executes a mortgage of $100,000 on Blackacre in favor of mortgagee number 1. Then the next year, in 2008, mortgagor executes a $50,000 mortgage on Blackacre in favor of mortgagee number 2. And then in January 2014, mortgagee number 1 forecloses on its mortgage when $90,000 is still due on that mortgage. Mortgagee number 1 notifies mortgagee number 2 of the foreclosure sale, and mortgagee number 2 joins in the sale with $48,000 still due on mortgagee number two's mortgage. The mortgage sale yields $145,000 with a cost of sale of $5,000. So the question becomes, how are the proceeds of the sale distributed? We start first with the cost of sale, which is $5,000. Then we go to mortgagee number one, who is the foreclosing mortgagee. Mortgagee number one is due $90,000, so mortgagee number one gets the full $90,000, which satisfies, that is, fulfills that mortgage. Then we move to mortgagee number two. Mortgagee number two was owed $48,000, which we still have left over. So mortgagee number two also gets the full amount due, $48,000, and mortgagee number two is also satisfied. We actually have $2,000 left over, so the remaining $2,000 will be paid to the mortgagor. Problem number two begins with a very similar set of facts. However, we're going to see a significant difference when we get to the proceeds of the mortgage sale. So once again, mortgagor executes a $100,000 mortgage in favor of mortgagee number one. The next year, mortgagor executes a $50,000 mortgage in favor of mortgagee number two. And then in 2014, mortgagee number one forecloses its mortgage when $90,000 is still due on that mortgage. Mortgagee number one again notifies mortgagee number two of the foreclosure sale, and again mortgagee number two joins in the sale with $48,000 still due on mortgagee number two's mortgage. However, this time the mortgage sale yields just $100,000. Again, the cost of sale is $5,000. So how do we distribute the proceeds of sale? Once again, we begin with the cost of sale, and in this case the cost of sale is $5,000. Next, we move to mortgagee number one, who has a debt of $90,000 still due to him. We have sufficient proceeds left to distribute the full $90,000 to mortgagee number one, and so that mortgage will be satisfied. However, we next move to mortgagee number two, who was owed $48,000. Only $5,000 is left, though, from the proceeds of sale, so the $5,000 goes to mortgagee number two. And mortgagee number two's lien on the property is extinguished. Now, that leaves mortgagee number two short a significant amount of money, and mortgagee number two may seek a deficiency judgment if a deficiency judgment is authorized in that jurisdiction. Of course, we've run out of funds, so nothing is paid to mortgagor. As problems 1 and 2 suggest, certain mortgagee interests in mortgaged properties may be extinguished when the property is sold through a foreclosure sale. Let's review the rules. First, we start with interests that are junior to the mortgage that's being foreclosed. A junior mortgage is generally extinguished in a foreclosure sale. However, that junior mortgage may not be extinguished if the junior mortgagee doesn't get proper notice and is not allowed to participate in the foreclosure sale. Interests that are senior to the mortgage being foreclosed get an option. A senior mortgagee can choose to participate in the mortgage sale and then will be paid first. On the other hand, a senior interest may choose to sit out and not participate in the mortgage sale. In that case, the senior mortgage will not get paid from the proceeds of sale, but will survive the mortgage sale. The senior mortgagee, as I mentioned, gets the option. So the senior mortgagee will look at the market. If the senior mortgagee thinks that the property will sell for an amount that's sufficient to cover the mortgage debt due to the senior mortgagee will probably participate in the foreclosure sale. However, if the senior mortgagee thinks that the market will not produce a sale that's sufficient to cover the interest of the senior mortgagee will sit out the mortgage sale and thus will survive the mortgage sale. If the proceeds of the foreclosure sale are not sufficient to cover any liens that are being foreclosed, then the mortgagee may obtain a deficiency judgment against the mortgagor or someone who has assumed the mortgage personally based on the note. And that, of course, assumes that the jurisdiction in which the foreclosure sale is occurring permits deficiency judgments. Not all jurisdictions permit a deficiency judgment. To understand liability for a deficiency judgment fully, we must also consider transfers by the mortgagor. Transfers by the mortgagor can fall into three different categories. First, we have a transfer that is subject to the mortgage. If the mortgagor transfers the property subject to the mortgage and mortgage payments are not made, the mortgagee may foreclose on the mortgage and may force the property to be sold. However, the transferee of the mortgage does not have personal liability. The second type of transfer is an assumption of the mortgage. If the transferee of real property assumes the mortgage and mortgage payments aren't made, then the mortgagee may of course foreclose on the mortgage and force the property to be sold. In this situation, the transferee of the mortgage does have personal liability for any deficiency. The third type of transfer is a novation. In a novation, the transferee of real property and the mortgagee make a new agreement, and in that new agreement, they agree that the transferee will assume the mortgage and the mortgagor will be released from liability. Novation is an exception, not the rule, because of course the mortgagee will usually like to keep more than one person liable on the mortgage note. We're now going to work through a series of problems that deal with deficiency judgments. For the purposes of all of these problems, we're going to presume that the jurisdiction does permit a deficiency judgment. Let's start with problem number 3. In this problem, Alpha buys a house for $250,000. To finance the purchase, Alpha pays $50,000 in cash and borrows $200,000 from Beta. Alpha gives Beta a promissory note for $200,000 and secures the note with a mortgage on Alpha's house. Alpha then sells the house to Gamma for $275,000. Gamma pays Alpha $100,000 in cash and takes the property subject to Alpha's mortgage to Beta, which had an outstanding balance of $175,000. However, Gamma subsequently defaults on the mortgage. The question becomes, who is liable on that mortgage? We begin with Gamma's liability. If Gamma defaults on the mortgage, Beta may foreclose the mortgage. However, Beta may not recover a deficiency judgment against Gamma because Gamma took the property subject to the mortgage, which means that Gamma did not take on any personal liability on the note. What about Alpha's liability? Once again, if Gamma defaults, Beta may foreclose on the mortgage, and Alpha remains liable on his personal promise to pay that he made in the promissory note. Therefore, Beta can foreclose on the mortgage and may recover against Alpha any resulting deficiency. Problem number 4 begins with a similar set of facts. However, we're going to see a significant difference when the property is sold to Gamma. So we begin again with Alpha, who purchases a house for $250,000. To finance the purchase, Alpha pays $50,000 in cash and borrows $200,000 from Beta. Alpha gives Beta a promissory note for $200,000 and secures the note with a mortgage on Alpha's house. Then Alpha sells the house to Gamma for $275,000. Gamma pays Alpha $100,000 in cash, but this time Gamma assumes liability on Alpha's note to Beta and Alpha's mortgage to Beta, which then had an outstanding balance of $175,000. Once again, Gamma subsequently defaults on the mortgage. Let's take a look at Gamma's liability in this problem. If Gamma defaults, of course, Beta may foreclose on the mortgage. This time, however, Gamma also has personal liability for any resulting deficiency. Gamma has personal liability in this case because Gamma assumed the mortgage, which means that Gamma took on personal liability on the mortgage note. What about Alpha's liability? Even if Gamma defaults, Alpha remains secondarily liable on the promise to pay that he made in his promissory note. Therefore, Beta may foreclose on the mortgage, and Beta may recover against Alpha any resulting deficiency. Of course, in this particular case, Beta will not be allowed to have two recoveries. Beta will be made whole with one recovery, which may be achieved from either Gamma or Alpha. Problem number 5 again begins with a similar set of facts, but once again we're going to see a significant difference when we get to Gamma's purchase of the property. So let's review again. Alpha buys a house for $250,000. To finance the purchase, Alpha pays $50,000 in cash and borrows $200,000 from Beta. Alpha gives Beta a promissory note for $200,000 and secures the note with a mortgage on Alpha's house. Then Alpha sells the house to Gamma for $275,000. Gamma pays Alpha $100,000 in cash, but this time Beta and Gamma execute a novation under which Gamma assumed the liability on the note and mortgage, which had an outstanding balance of $175,000. The novation also released Alpha from liability on the note and the mortgage. Once again, Gamma defaulted on the mortgage. We start with Gamma's liability. If Gamma defaults, of course, Beta may foreclose on the mortgage. In this case, Beta may also recover against Gamma for any resulting deficiency. Remember, Gamma and Beta entered into a novation, which is a new agreement. In this new agreement, Gamma assumed liability on the promissory note. Therefore, Gamma does have personal liability for any resulting deficiency. What about Alpha's liability in this question? If Gamma defaults, Beta may not recover a deficiency judgment against Alpha. Remember, Beta and Gamma made a novation, and in this novation, in addition to Gamma's assumption of liability on the mortgage note, Beta and Gamma agreed to release Alpha from liability on the mortgage note. And because Alpha has been released from liability through the novation, Alpha no longer is liable for a deficiency judgment. Let's do one last problem, which begins with the same set of facts, but which adds significant complications after Gamma purchases the property. So to review, Alpha buys a house for $250,000. Alpha finances the purchase with $50,000 in cash and with a $200,000 loan from Beta. That loan is secured with a mortgage to Beta. Alpha then sells the house to Gamma for $275,000. Gamma pays Alpha $100,000 in cash, and in this question assumes liability on Alpha's mortgage to Beta. The balance on that mortgage was then $175,000. Gamma then sells the house to Delta for $300,000. Delta pays Gamma $150,000 in cash and assumes liability on Alpha's mortgage to Beta, which then had a balance of $150,000. In this problem, Delta defaults on the mortgage. The question becomes, who is liable on that mortgage? Let's begin with Delta. If Delta defaults, Beta may of course foreclose on the mortgage. And because Delta assumed the mortgage, Delta is also responsible for any deficiency. What about Gamma's liability? If Delta defaults, Gamma remains secondarily liable on the mortgage because Gamma also assumed the mortgage. So beta may foreclose on the mortgage and may recover against gamma any resulting deficiency. Finally, what about alpha's liability? If delta defaults, alpha remains secondarily liable on the promise to pay that alpha made in the original promissory note. Therefore, beta may foreclose on the mortgage and may recover against alpha any resulting deficiency. Remember, of course, that beta will be entitled to just one recovery, which can be satisfied in this problem from alpha, gamma, or delta. The next topic is modification of priorities. The mortgage priorities we've previously discussed may be modified in several situations. The first is the purchase money mortgage. A purchase money mortgage is a mortgage that's given to a seller of real property or a third-party lender, to the extent that the proceeds of the loan are used to acquire title to real property or to build improvements on the real property if the mortgage is given as part of the same transaction in which title is acquired. If a purchase money mortgage is created, it's given priority over a lien, such as a judgment lien or a homestead claim, that attaches to the property through actions of the mortgagor, even if the lien was recorded first. The second type of modification occurs when a senior mortgage is modified. If a senior mortgage is modified, a junior mortgage may prevail over the modification if the modification prejudices materially the holder of the junior mortgage. Let's look at some examples. In the first set of examples, the modification does materially prejudice the junior mortgage. These examples include an increase in the amount of principal or an increase in the interest rate if the rate under the original mortgage was fixed. Let's consider several examples of modifications that normally do not prejudice the junior mortgage. These include extension of the mortgage maturity date because it gives the mortgagor more time to pay, and a rescheduling of installment payments. Let's now consider transfers by the mortgagee. The mortgagee may decide to transfer its interest in the mortgaged property. Generally, the mortgage follows transfer of the mortgage note. If the note is negotiable, the transferee may qualify as a holder in due course, and as a holder in due course, the transferee can take free and clear of certain personal defenses, such as lack of consideration, duress by non-physical threat, and fraud in the inducement. However, even if the transferee is a holder in due course, the transferee will take subject to real defenses that include infancy, duress by physical threat, and fraud in the factum. Our final topic is mortgage alternatives. Let's begin with the deed of trust. In a deed of trust, the debtor or note maker is the settlor, and the settlor gives a deed of trust to a trustee who is closely connected to the lender. In the event of a default, the trustee is directed to proceed with a foreclosure sale. Today, deeds of trust are generally treated just like mortgages. The second mortgage alternative is the installment land sale contract, sometimes known as a contract for deed. In an installment land sale contract, the buyer takes possession under a contract of sale and makes payments to the seller. The seller delivers a deed and legal title to the buyer only when the payments have been completed. In an installment land sale contract, foreclosure generally isn't used. Instead, the contract provides for forfeiture of all installments paid, which allows the lender to retake the property. However, some states do require a foreclosure proceeding even in a land sale contract. And once again, today, installment land sale contracts are generally treated just like mortgages. This concludes the lecture on mortgages.